Here's a question. How do we improve upon our world? There is no issue, no debate, no facet of political life which is not governed by this simple question. Imagine then that you could somehow create this perfect world, your design process unfettered by gods, kings, or common morality. But there is just one terrible catch. With the roll of a dice, you are powerless in determining where you will actually fall within this society. With all this in mind, can you justify your world? This is called the veil of ignorance, whereby even the greediest of biased social planners must challenge their worldview through a simple game of chance. If forced to be the serfs of the British Empire or the Jews of the German Reich, for instance, the flaws of unjust societies become immediately apparent. Even the ideal democracy has its blind spots. The system is arguably restrained by its own participants, whereby it can only ever be as good as the people within it. Democracy, however, is designed to maximize fairness, generally unconstrained by a ruling elite, class, or ethnos. In turn, the subversion of human rights is a systemic bug and not a theoretical feature, which is continuously corrected through democracy. To quote Hubert Humphrey, "The moral test of government is how that government treats those who are in the dawn of life, the children, those who are in the twilight of life, the elderly, those who are in the shadows of life, the sick, the needy, and the handicapped." As such, a great society can only be judged by how it treats its weakest members, given the right to negotiate their terms within their social contract, obligating their government to be ruled by consent of the governed. As of today, there remains a flaw in this system: their exclusion from the voting process. If the weak have no say in organizing their own institutions, one man's democracy is another man's dictatorship. A government for the people, by the people, cannot abandon universal values, arbitrarily deciding that some people are actually more people than others. Otherwise, we subject ourselves to the pig hypocrisy of Orwellian animal farms, double-thinking our own biases into a mental knot where fellow men are anything but. To deprive any individual from democracy is to undermine its very concept, robbing the system of true representative justice. This is why children, from cradle to college, deserve the right to vote. No matter race, color, or creed, democracy is within everyone's self-interest. History has shown that the expansion of voting rights coincides with universal societal improvement. Beyond the 18th century, discrimination by class was condemned, abolishing the uncontrolled rule of gods, kings, and nobles alike. By the 19th century, we extended such umbrage for those discriminated by race, assisting black and brown individuals in their ongoing emancipation from slavery to suffrage. Jointly, these efforts extended into the 20th century, which also saw discrimination by sex purged from common life, paving the way for women's suffrage, stronger female representation in government, criminalizing violence against women, and allowing their participation in the workforce. Only on one occasion has age discrimination been critically examined by our society: during the Vietnam War, when young men were drafted into a war of questionable legitimacy, with no ability to democratically object to their own participation. On what grounds can the powerful send the powerless to be military livestock? It was through easy exclusion, built on the hypocritical framework that one is too young to vote, yet old enough to wield weapons on the battlefield. This flawed logic spurred the 26th Amendment, to restrict the government from involuntarily seizing if one lacks the right to vote. It is a shared duality: a government for the people, by the people, necessitating your institutions must serve you if you are to serve them. Why should a representative democracy holding me at the point of a gun contradict itself by demanding something of me without me having a say in its direction? If we saw such a violation as so immoral so as to require a constitutional amendment, why stop there? After all, governments are no strangers to wielding their perversions against the helpless and weak. It was Pericles who said that just because you do not take an interest in politics does not mean that politics will not take an interest in you. This is especially true of children. We like to pretend that politics is a struggle amongst adults, yet our institutions impact our offspring all the same. Consider the events of 2018, children being compelled to attend classes at Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School, where a deranged mass shooter put the students' lives in the firing line. This one event, resulting in the death of 17 underage students, spawned a national debate where their most knowledgeable survivors couldn't even vote for their own representatives. School funding, safety protocols, mental health care reform, gun control, attendance, or anything. Almost none of their policy platforms, as proposed by their very own Never Again Marjory Stoneman Douglas PAC, actually made it into federal or state law. Children are subjected to the same air we all breathe, but have no say in what our environmental policy will look like in the upcoming 10 to 15 years, despite the increased adolescent knowledge on the subject of climate change. According to a study from Nature Climate Change, conducted by social scientists and ecologists from North Carolina State University, researchers found 10 to 14-year-olds' exposure to climate change coursework not only affected their own views, but also the views of their parents. As written by Lydia Denworth about the findings, teaching a child about the warming climate often raised concerns among parents about the issues. Fathers and conservative parents showed the biggest change in attitudes, and daughters were more effective than sons in influencing parental views. In a statement to the Scientific American, the paper's lead author, Daniel Lawson, said, "The model of intergenerational learning provides a dual benefit. It prepares kids for the future since they're going to deal with the brunt of climate change's impact, and it empowers them to help make a difference on the issue now by providing them a structure to have these conversations with older generations, to bring us together to work on climate change." This is quite a brunt to the popular counter-notion that children are just too easily persuaded by their parents to make an informed vote, while, at the same time, claiming that they are also too unpredictable in how they will vote. Both statements cannot be true at once. Every individual is different in their own right. If civic knowledge is the optimal factor, what gives an adult who cannot tell a socialist from a fascist the right to vote? What makes their vote any more legitimate from the smartest child to the dumbest adult? Why does age determine a rational voter versus an irrational voter? It is intellectually lazy to neglect how every voter, regardless of their age, can be too easily persuaded by their environment. Why hold children to a higher standard that even adults have no obligation to reach? If the mark of a justified vote was both true intelligence and authentic perception, we would likely see a return of literacy tests, poll taxes, and other technocratic standards ensuring that we are ruled by smart elites. If we're going to means test democracy, what should stop a smart child from succeeding where a dumb adult could fail? Why must we walk back from this preconceived notion that restricting children is inherently justified, but never the same of adults? If it is not some soft heuristic dodge from the rights of young voters, then why the inconsistency? By what standard is there a bad vote versus a good vote? Who should judge such a notion? Every Republican vote is a bad vote in my eyes. If I were the ordained autocrat of America, why shouldn't I restrict a whole party of idiots and send them to the front lines? If it were anyone else, what should stop them from targeting the old, the young, the mentally challenged, or any race deemed to be too low IQ? In the past, we saw these methods as discriminatory, used to deprive people of their legitimate participation in controlling their own governance. Even today, these arguments all fall apart if tyrants have to subject themselves to the veil of ignorance, leaving stacked decks and card counters at the door to live by their own rules. For all the faults of democracy, yielding multiple points of potential failure, tyrannies rely only on a select few, its adherents gambling a greater risk in the hope for a greater return with no obligations of such in writing. For anyone below the voting age, their destiny is functionally determined the same way. It's not like children are free from the obligations of their system. Consider how 1 in 5 children born today is born in poverty. Yet the biggest social welfare program this country has doesn't go to children. It goes to seniors. By age 11, you're considered capable of criminal intent. In some states, you can even be charged as an adult for a crime, signifying that you're responsible enough to carry adult culpability for your actions despite not actually being an adult. At age 15, you're old enough to work, to pay taxes, to drive. You can join the military of your own volition just 2 years later, which may as well spit on that 26th Amendment. People under the age of 18 are already jailed, taxed, regulated, and even conscripted for war, yet are conversely treated as being too irresponsible to pull the lever for the ones calling the shots. These are not paternal protections, but rather predatory exploitations, hypocritical in their application, leaving children to reap the consequences of their society without a say in the matter. And it bites both ways. Either children are too infantile to understand their system, or they're old enough to work within it, drawing sweat, blood, tears, and battle cries in its systemic favor every day. This exclusion hypocrisy could not stand under scrutiny. To agree with democratic values, the legitimacy of a child's vote and an adult's vote are inseparable. It is fair to say that there is some necessity to protect children who are uniquely sensitive. Simply examining a child's browsing history might reveal them to be under the influence of predatory persuasions, taken by advantage for their gullibility and even their sexuality. Leave a child wandering alone at night, without any means of contact or protection, and they could find themselves helpless to the grotesque whims of their local pedophiles and gangs. Shove the smallest 12-year-old down into a company's stuttering manufacturing machine, and you could have a dead 12-year-old. I understand perfectly well why we deprive children of certain rights in the context of danger, but there is no sexual predator hiding in the voting booth. There is no junkie with a knife behind the curtains. No fault in the voting machine that requires extraction by a stretcher. What possible safety precaution could justify depriving children the right to vote? Democracy is designed to be a safety precaution, liberating every voter from undue bondage. Historically, the chance of non-voters receiving such protections were slim, as the voiceless cannot say no, and their scoundrels have no reason to listen regardless. What harm is there in a child's vote? Another oft-repeated argument is that children are constrained by their environments, particularly their family interest. That is to say, children will only vote as their parents tell them to. Again, though, we are faced with a nagging historical parallel. This argument has been used to deprive women the right to vote, believing it would simply double the votes of their husbands or fathers under the guise of coercion. Similar arguments were made against black and brown voters. From the 1960s to today, we hear of the so-called democratic plantation, a racist notion denying minorities of agency by decrying them as only loyal to those providing the welfare checks to their parents and who emancipated their grandparents during the era of civil rights. Truthfully, every voter is shaped by their interests. This is the very purpose of having the right to vote in the first place. The notion that people carry their politics over from their family should not negate their right to vote. It is upon the politicians, the lobbyists, and their fellow man to win their votes over. What does it say of one's rhetoric if one cannot convince supposedly gullible children to their side? This argument amounts to people can be persuaded, which is at the very heart of free speech in a democratic system. It is to persuade. When all of these arguments fail, people often turn to a last-ditch effort to say brain development is a reasonable impediment to one's voting rights, suggesting that the voting age threshold should actually be raised to 25 instead. But why? Human development from those pivotal teenage years to 25 are gradual, generally affecting one's impulse control over other neurological factors. Voting is not an impulsive action. You cannot impulsively vote. In America, electoral politics is a year-long procedural venture of media tours, issues canvassing, candidates debating, direct action, waiting hours at a time to go out and pull a lever for the Republican or the Democrat. This argument only works in the context of our vices, drugs, drinking, sexual deviancy, which is completely different from participation in the voting system. Children and adults would have the exact same elongated time to understand the issues, the candidates' positions, and the best course for their government. Impulse plays no role in going out to vote, let alone in the vote's legitimacy. So what's to be gained from allowing children the right to vote? People who vote young tend to remain committed voters throughout the rest of their lives. In turn, elected leaders might be forced to give a shit about their young constituents, their schools, their funding, all previously ignored functions of political life. Where parents might see a cut in school funding as tax relief, a kid might see their future being robbed. Issues which most negatively affect children, such as poverty, will be given greater focus on account of the youth vote. In America, voter turnout could rise above the abysmal rates of today. In education, children are expected to learn all of their cognitive functions in civil history, from simple reading and writing to the importance of the civil rights movement and holding their representatives to account, yet are told this investment will only pay off when they reach the age of 18. Children, holding a vested interest in the future of their country, can ensure the state of their own inherited society. They are governed by the same laws we are all governed by, drink the same water, breathe the same air, live in the same environment, and likely have to take on the debts and deficits we as adults burden them with. It is silly to deny the political reality being imposed on children. If they are to carry out the responsibilities of work, criminal justice, transportation, and even warfare, it is then unreasonable to deny them a vote. There is no understating the ability of children, who can be the recipients of Nobel Prize awards, members of campaigns to reduce gun violence, lobbyists for major environmental issues, and activists for child education. They have been attacked for daring to speak on any of these issues because they are children, all while demonstrating heightened understanding beyond some of our own capabilities. So what is to be lost from governments listening to their children? Is a child vote really any different from an adult vote? Couldn't the harm from one be easily replicated by another? Adults are not gods, kings, or immortals, all-knowing beings without fault. To restrict democracy to just their judgment is to take a bigger risk on who decides our future. Every argument you could make to restrict children could easily be made to current eligible voting populations. And just as we saw those initiatives as examples of tyranny, so should discrimination by age. Children are not hostile agents to democracy. They are simply people, holding a capacity to understand their world and a fundamental interest in shaping it in their image. Remember, democracy's legitimacy is derived by the consent of the governed. It is, therefore, illegitimate to deprive children the right to vote. If you disagree, feel free to roll the dice on your perfect democracy without any guarantees on who you will be within it. Now justify your position.